On 28 January 1798, Mulhouse was duly annexed. Geneva followed on 26 March. Rural revolts against urban domination broke out in the hinterlands of Basel and Zurich. While in the Vaud, patriots proclaimed the independence of Bern. But none of these outbreaks, except in the Basel district, had as much to do with the establishing a unitary republic as with pursuing far older antagonisms. The Vaud rebels proclaimed their own tiny Le Mans Republic, oblivious of wider loyalties. And again, with the exception of Basel, the urban patriciates showed unexpected vigor in moving to repress the rebels. The French had to intervene directly, and in February, General Brune was ordered to occupy Bern. Confusion followed. Brune was at first ordered to establish no less than 3 separate sister republics, conforming roughly to linguistic divisions. In Catholic mountain districts, peasants led by their priests now rose against the invading French and were cut down in their hundreds. The appalled Swiss patriots in Paris protested that only a single, centralized sister republic could hope to contain such outbreaks in the long term, and the Directory yielded to their calls. On 22nd March, Brune proclaimed the Helvetic Republic and declared its constitution to be that drafted by Ox and French collaborators. No convention was called to ratify it. The Dutch example had demonstrated the perils of that. With its 23 equal cantons, bicameral legislature, and executive of 5 directors, it was simply imposed. When the legislature first met a month later, with Ox as president of the Senate, only 10 cantons were represented, the others refusing to condone a system on which they had not been consulted. Once more, French troops had to intervene to coerce them. In the first international act of the new state, the treaty with France of 2nd August, which granted her perpetual access to the Alpine passes, guaranteed the presence of such troops for the foreseeable future. The Helvetic Republic was not even a conquered enemy, like the Dutch, but that did not save it from depredations, with a French army of occupation always brought. Under pressure from Ox and La Harpe, The Directory promised not to impose requisitions, but the well-stocked treasuries of the main Swiss cities were impounded to pay the army of Italy and to equip the Egyptian expedition being fitted out at Toulon. War taxes were imposed, and pillaging, as everywhere, only sporadically controlled. As early as June 1798, 2 of the new Swiss Directory were replaced on French insistence, because they had not proved to cooperate enough towards their protectors. But as the 1798 drew to a close, the French proved unable even to guarantee protection. In November, the Austrian troops occupied the eastern cantons, making Switzerland for the first time in centuries a theater of war. Soon, the Russians, in their turn, would be campaigning there. The French now demanded that the Helvetic Republic conscript 18,000 men into a militia to act as auxiliaries to the French armies. But despite the support of Ox and other leading architects of the new republic, the legislature refused the demand. All it would authorize was a volunteer army, whose members never reached a quarter of those required. The Swiss still remembered the grisly fate of the last Swiss regiments in French service, butchered at the Tuileries in August 1792. In other respects, however, the new authorities showed themselves eager to follow the French lead. A massive program of rationalization was announced for the Republic, including abolition of internal tolls and customs barriers, guilds and corporations, the tithe and feudal dues. Church lands were taken into national possession, and monasteries forbidden to recruit new novices. In Protestant areas, such measures were applauded, but had little impact. In Catholic ones, which included some of the remotest valleys whose traditions of self-government were among the most democratic in Europe, they caused deep resentment. The new Constitution, declared one mountain priest, seeks to rob us of our holy religion, our freedom enjoyed undisturbed for hundreds of years, and our democratic constitution inherited from our blessed ancestors. And while French troops made short work of the small rebel army assembled by the peasants of the Valais in May 1798, guerrilla resistance continued and was not so easy to deal with, especially when war engulfed the country and gave the French more pressing priorities. When that happened, too, the initial ban on requisitioning soon broke down, making the Republic's French defenders barely distinguishable from the Austrian and Russian enemies, who throughout 1799 poured across its borders, from the Tyrol in the east and up the Alpine passes from Italy. It was Bonaparte's conquests in Italy that had sealed Switzerland's fate. From Italy, too, came the model for her reorganization. Yet, although the first sister republic, the Batavian, was already in existence when the French crossed the Alps in the spring of 1796, nobody, not even Bonaparte, seems to have yet thought of establishing parallel client states in the other conquered territories. When in his initial march across the Alps, Bonaparte swept aside the army of Victor Amadeus III of Piedmont, a small group of the latter's subjects, sympathetic to French ideas, proclaimed a republic at Alba. They were ignored. Anxious only to remove the Piedmontese army from the military balance, Bonaparte signed an armistice with the defeated king and left him a free hand to deal with the rebels against his authority. It was true that over the winter of 1795 and 6, various Italian political exiles in France, coordinated by Buonarroti, extolled the prospects for liberating Italy and tried to convince the Directory that they could organize an uprising in Piedmont to facilitate the advance of the Republic's armies. But Buonarroti's involvement in the Babeuf plot, uncovered in May 1796, discredited him and his friends in directorial eyes. His radical social and political ideas would be just as dangerous in occupied territories as they were in France. Suspicions, far from groundless, that the true sympathies of Italian Francophiles lay with Jacobinism and the ideals of year two rather than directorial moderation, would hamper their prospects throughout the 3 years of the first French occupation. Equally well-founded was the French belief that Italian Jacobins enjoyed scant popular support. "There can be no question of republicanizing Italy," reported one consul on the eve of Bonaparte's triumphs. "The people are not at all inclined to accept liberty. Neither are they worthy of this boon. In view of their degradation, all we can hope for is the silence born of cowardice and the respect born of fear. They execrate our principles as contrary to their passions and their prejudices." In any case, the Directory's strategy in invading Italy was merely to occupy and exploit it, exchanging it for the Rhineland at the final peace. Yet the French were welcomed by more people in Lombardy than in any other territory they invaded except the Dutch Republic. Especially in the cities, middle-class intellectuals welcomed outside intervention as a means of breaking the recently reinforced clerical and aristocratic stranglehold on Italian life. During an unprecedented half-century of peace and relative prosperity since 1748, intellectual life had flourished in northern Italy, and the activities of reforming monarchs like Leopold of Tuscany and his elder brother, the Emperor Joseph II, ruling the Duchy of Milan, had convinced many thinking Italians that enlightenment would soon triumph throughout the peninsula. But in the early 1790s, these hopes were shattered. Joseph died, and Leopold went back to Vienna to succeed him, dying himself soon afterwards. And as horror stories rolled in from France, reforms were abandoned, and governments clamped fierce controls on independent intellectual life. The Bourbon monarchies of Parma and Naples were swept by hysteria, and the Pope anathematized reform as a threat to faith itself. More ominously still, from the viewpoint of bourgeois radicals, this tide of reaction enjoyed some obvious popular support. When Leopold II left Tuscany, exultant rioters, to cries of "Viva Maria," drove the Jansenistic priests he had installed from their churches and put back the images, relics, and pious trappings that the reformers had tried to banish. But in 1796, as the French poured into the Lombard plains and smashed every Austrian army sent against them, hitherto frustrated Italian intellectuals were overcome with excitement. They could not believe the invaders would not favor them, and while refugees from Piedmontese persecution of the Alba Republicans trailed after Bonaparte on his triumphal march, Jacobins in his path unceremoniously deposed their local rulers and proclaimed the rule of liberty and equality. On arrival in Milan, Bonaparte found a club of 800 members, mostly lawyers and merchants, waiting to greet him. And within a week, this Society of the Friends of Liberty and Equality was producing its own journal. A few more weeks, and it was advocating an ideal most people had thought utopian until then: Italian unity. Bonaparte, in turn, recognized how these sentiments and those expressing them could be used. In a proclamation issued on 19 May, he denounced kings, the rich, and the privileged, and spoke vaguely of achieving the independence of Lombardy, which should bring its happiness. But, he added, the French army could not achieve these lofty ends without supplies. Supplies which France could not provide. So the former Austrian provinces would be required to make a very small contribution to their expenses. And the new men now in power in Milan would be entrusted with the task of raising it. So began the inevitable exploitation of Italy and of France's Italian friends. A general who promised his ragged army unlimited booty when they descended into the richest plains in the world was now about to keep his word, to them at least. A war tax of 20 millions was the very small contribution announced in the proclamation. Meanwhile, requisitioning of foodstuffs proceeded ruthlessly in the army's wake. Stockpiles were established for plundered grain and wine, and planes were made to corral 4,000 cattle. Municipal treasuries were everywhere impounded, as were the contents of the public pawn shops, so characteristic of Italian cities. Tuscan neutrality was cheerfully violated on the excuse that massive British supplies were stockpiled at Leghorn. When the forewarned islanders evacuated, most of them in a remarkable amphibious scratch operation, the city was stripped of all its other resources. Works of art were systematically removed from churches and palaces and shipped to France by the cartload. Bullion, too. In 1796 alone, Bonaparte remitted something like 45 millions to Paris, thanks to the Milanese authorities compounding for irregular extractions to the tune of $1 million per month. He was also able to pay his soldiers mostly in cash at a time when it was completely unavailable in France, and when requisitions, if paid for at all, were settled up in the ill-fated territorial mandates at face value. Needless to say, the commander-in-chief and his main lieutenants made personal fortunes. But scarcely had these depredations begun before they ran into resistance. At Pavia on 25th May, a Jacobin administration set up by the French army as it passed through like a swarm of locusts was overthrown as soon as the front had moved on by riotous peasants outraged by anti-religious excesses. Bonaparte himself had to turn aside to deal with the rising, doing so by delivering the city to 24 hours of unrestrained sack. Other resistance was less spectacular, but harder to deal with, since most of it was rural, whereas most towns had their colonels of Jacobins ready to greet, and initially at least, cooperate with the invaders in organizing the exploitation of their fellow citizens. In the countryside, the French was seen simply as godless foreign marauders to be resisted, ambushed, and harassed whenever opportunities occurred. Thus, there were peasant uprisings throughout the Lombard plains over the summer of '96, some of them resulting in massacres of isolated French units. Essentially local, however, they never came together, and the ebb and flow of the war zone made soldiers of all sides the peasants' enemy. Even in towns, the Jacobin honeymoon did not always last long. In Papal Bologna and Ferrara, occupied in June, crackdowns on subversives over the previous 2 years had left an atmosphere of anti-clerical resentment. The last execution in Bologna had taken place only 2 months before the French arrived. Bolognese Jacobins, therefore, were encouraged to draw up an independent constitution for their territory, which kept them busy and grateful for the rest of the year. Not surprisingly, the end product was based closely on the Constitution of Year 3, but no such freedom was allowed to turbulent radicals of Milan. By the end of May, their 2-week-old club had been dissolved and only began cautiously meeting again as a patriotic society. 2 months later, in September, it was reborn yet again as an Academy of Literature and Public Instruction with the sanction of Bonaparte. But as soon as it began agitating for a national convention to regenerate the whole of Italy, adopting a distinctive tricolor cockade of red, white, and green, it met renewed French resistance. Neither the Directory in Paris nor Bonaparte had any interest in uniting Italy, so that when in November a renewed Austrian offensive threatened to expel the French, the club prepared to seize power the moment they withdrew. A demonstration was organized to plant a liberty tree in the city center and proclaim, with legal formalities, the independence of the Lombard nation. But the Austrians were once more defeated, and the French, more firmly in control than ever, crushed the movement and the club which had sponsored it. Yet Bonaparte realized that to spurn such aspirations was to turn his back on France's surest source of support. The energies of Italian patriots should be harnessed, if possible, rather than rejected. It was for this reason that, in the autumn, he encouraged those whom French power had placed in control at Bologna and Ferrara, and at Modena, a duchy also swamped by the French tide, to concert their action against local conservative resistance. Nor did he demur when, at the end of December, their representatives meeting at Reggio declared themselves a single, one and indivisible Cispadane Republic. In fact, he intervened personally to expedite the drafting of the new state's constitution, which was eventually proclaimed on 27 March 1797. Thus, the first of the Italian sister republics was born, and it was recognized by the Pope, at whose expense it had largely been created, in the Treaty of Tolentino in February. Lombard radicals watched these moves with mounting excitement. Although Bonaparte refused to allow them to send representatives to Reggio Congress, when the Cispadanes adopted the new tricolor and, following an example set in Milan the previous autumn, set up a National Guard, or Italian Legion, to give armed support to the new state, they saw clear signs of common aspirations. Accordingly, the results of the first elections, held in April 1797 under a constitution once more closely modeled on that of France, came as a shock. Large numbers of conservatives were returned under the influence of the clergy. Bonaparte, too, was shocked, occupied since February with his final pursuit of the Austrians up the Alpine valleys towards Vienna. He had been in no position to control these first free expression of Italian opinion. Like Lombardy, he complained, the Cispadine Republic needs a provisional government for 3 or 4 years, during which the influence of the priests can be lessened. Otherwise, you will have done nothing by giving liberty. However, I shall start by joining Lombardy with and the Cispadane under a single provisional government. This was on 1st May. Within a few weeks, 29 June, the Cisalpine Republic had been created, and the short-lived Cispadane had been incorporated into it. From Paris, it looked like the deliberate creation of a personal client state, and the imperious way in which the general went on to dictate its constitution and rule it by decree all that summer from lordly surroundings in the palace of Mombello suggested long meditated ambitions in this direction. In fact, the concept seems to have emerged much more haphazardly, and at every stage, strategic considerations seem to have been paramount. The Cispadane Republic was a buffer against attack from the south with viable natural frontiers. Nothing comparable could have been created in Lombardy until the Austrians were expelled from Mantua. In Venetian territory, marched with the eastern and northern limits of French occupation along purely jurisdictional lines of no strategic logic. Venice had remained neutral in the conflict, but straddling as it did all the main Austrian lines of communication with Italy, its territory was a major theater of war throughout the campaign. When Bonaparte disappeared northwards towards Leoben, there were vicious outbreaks of hostility to the garrisons he had left to guard his lines of communication through the terra firma, culminating on 17 April with the massacre of 400 French soldiers in Verona. In response, he issued blood-curdling threats against the Doge and Senate of Venice. But when the Austrians at Leoben asked for compensation for their losses in Belgium and Lombardy, the outrages offered a perfect occasion for a diplomatic deal. Venetia would be given to Habsburgs, shorn of a number of outlying territories, which would consolidate French conquest further west. When, therefore, 2 months later, the Cisalpine Republic came into being, it had a coherent frontier to the east, at least along the Adige, which the Austrians accepted, along with their own acquisition of the rest of Venetia at Campo Formio the following October. In these circumstances, the creation of a consolidated North Italian sister republic was logical. The alternative, to incorporate the conquered territories into France, would have made little sense and would have outraged all her Italian friends. As it was, they were outraged enough, expecting to draft their own constitution in the Cispadine manner. They found it dictated to them by Bonaparte, and all but the most moderate found themselves excluded from positions of authority in the new state. Although the new constitution, promulgated on 9th July, was elective, Bonaparte decreed that so that the passage from a military to a constitutional regime should occur without shocks, without anarchy. He would nominate all members of executive and legislature for the first year of its operation. In the event, the Constitution only lasted 14 months, and the Republic itself only 7 more. But during that time, it became a byword both for French exploitation of allies. We do not wish to allow ourselves to be Cisalpinized, complained a Swiss official, as French requisitions began and for radical turbulence. Milan rapidly became a center for Jacobin refugees fleeing from Venice, from Piedmont, from the Papal States, and from Naples. They agitated constantly for an Italian republic, freedom of the press, and anti-noble and anti-clerical legislation, so long as Bonaparte remained in Italy. He acted decisively against such activity. The Constitution made no explicit provision for clubs when, imitating post-Fructidorian France, a constitutional circle was set up in November 1797. It was closed within a few days as a hotbed of anarchists. Not until he had left a month later was it allowed to reopen, and then it became an organ for all the views and opinions he had feared. Only too clearly the Jacobins of Milan dreamed of an Italian year number 2, to sweep away all obstacles. One female enthusiast even offered to marry the man who would bring her the Pope's head. The terms which France imposed on her latest sister republic were further grist to their mill. In February 1798, a treaty of alliance was signed. It stipulated that a French army of 25,000 would be stationed in the Republic and maintained at its expense. It was also required to raise and maintain an army of its own of 22,000 men, which it had no prospect of doing without resort to the always explosive conscription. Preferential tariffs were to be extended to French goods, while the British ones were to be totally excluded, given that the Republic was a French creation and depended utterly on France for its survival. These terms were perhaps not excessively onerous, but they shocked a wide range of opinion. While clubs in Milan and other cities denounced the treaty, the legislature refused to confirm it. Eventually, they yielded, but not before orders had gone out from Paris. At the suggestion of the Cisalpine ambassador there for a Cisalpine fructidor. In April 1798, accordingly, the legislative councils and the directory were purged, removing the most conservative of Bonaparte's nominees, much to his fury. and leaving in control elements much more sympathetic to the radicals of the clubs. Calls for Italian unity were now loudly renewed. The issue was becoming more urgent as separate sister republics appeared all over the peninsula. The ancient city republic of Genoa, quite unable to resist French power, had been transformed into the Ligurian Republic in June 97. Following the crushing of an uprising of Genoese patriots and their French collaborators, the new republic's constitution, drafted locally, was approved in a plebiscite in December. In striking contrast with Cisalpine experience. At the end of the same month, a riot in Rome resulted in the accidental death of a French general, and the ambassador, Bonaparte's brother Joseph, fled in panic to Florence. The Directory in renewed anti-clerical mood since Fructidor, ordered an invasion of what was left of the Papal States after the surrender at Tolentino. The Pope had no army, and Rome was occupied without resistance on 10 February 1798. 5 days later, a small group of Jacobins, most of whom were not native Romans but adventurers from the sister republics of the north, proclaimed a Roman republic. It was recognized on the spot by the French commander. The Pope was deported, but not until a popular uprising, the so-called Roman Vespers, was put down on 25th February, was the new state securely established. Echoes of it continued for days afterwards in the Alban Hills, and hundreds were shot in the mopping up which followed. Nor was there any question here of native Italians drafting their own constitution. A commission of jurists was sent from Paris. They produced a structure full of ancient Roman terminology with consuls, a senate, and a tribunate, but modern and Parisian in form. Like the Cisalpine constitution, it was to be operated by nominees, not elected officials, for its first year. And nothing was to be enacted without the consent of the French commandant, who was for good measure authorized to make whatever laws he saw fit. Nothing could have stated more explicitly that the new Italian republics existed primarily for the convenience of the great nation In the way these latest additions to the constellation of sister republics were treated emphasized the point. The first demand made on the Ligurian Republic, presumed inheritor of the traditional Genoese role as international banker, was for a loan of 800,000 francs. When the legislature refused, the French ambassador engineered a coup, 31st August of 98, which purged the leading resistors. Similarly, the continued fermentation at Milan, positively encouraged by the more radical elements left in control after the April purge, led to renewed pressure from Paris for French agents to assert themselves. The purpose of the Cisalpine Republic, a new ambassador was told in June 1798, was to serve the exclusive interests of the French Republic and to help it become, over the entire peninsula, the arbiter of all political contests. It must become powerful enough to be useful to us, but never so much that we are damaged. More conservative elements, hostile to ideas of Italian unification, should therefore be brought to power. A new constitution, modeled on that of the Roman Republic and with a restricted franchise based on the highest taxpayers, was proposed. Leaked in advance by General Brune, who had been ordered against his will to support its imposition with military force. It raised a furor in both Milan and Paris, where resurgent Jacobins feared that it would be a trial run for a constitutional remodeling in France itself. Nevertheless, it was imposed on 30th August, and Brune was ordered to ensure that the changes were ratified by primary assemblies. Instead, he secured ratification for the mass expulsion of moderates from the government, deliberately defying orders from Paris, in what was effectively the third Cisalpine coup d'etat in a year. A fourth followed his inevitable recall, with the 30 August Constitution finally being imposed, and Jacobins once more being expelled in December. This time, the response was more muted, for the War of the Second Coalition had begun, on whose outcome the fate of all the sister republics would depend. The first shots, in fact, had been fired in Italy. On 12th November, the Neapolitan army invaded the Roman Republic, and within 2 weeks it had taken its capital, to be welcomed by excited crowds disgusted by the anti-religious excesses of 10 months of Republican rule. During this time, churches had been plundered, pious fraternities dissolved, new monastic vows forbidden, and many religious houses closed down. in a state whose sole resources were religion and tourism, and whose swarming poor relied on clerical charities. These reforms were catastrophic. Paper money issued by the new local authorities had plummeted in value almost at once, exacerbating the problems. Even worse was to follow a few weeks later when the regrouped French forces returned to chase the invaders back to Naples. The Roman Jacobins resurfaced more militant than ever, now banning all public signs of religious practice, restricting ordinations, and imposing forced loans. French exactions were renewed, their total value reaching perhaps 70 millions. There was scarcely time to extend this pattern to the last of the sister republics. And the shortest lived, the Parthenopean Republic, proclaimed at Naples by Championnet on 26 January 1799. By this time, the directors wanted no more of such satellites. As the Austrians and Russians prepared to march into Switzerland and Italy, the French armies were already dangerously stretched, and the poor, remote Neapolitan kingdom had limited strategic value. Championnet knew this, and after the flight of Ferdinand IV's forces was at first content to conclude an armistice under which he occupied the northern provinces, but not the city of Naples, by far Italy's largest. All he demanded there was that Nelson and his British squadron should be denied a landing. But the panic-stricken king and queen abandoned Naples, sailing off to Sicily and Nelson. Chaos gripped the city as the volatile Neapolitan poor, the notorious Lazzaroni, armed to confront the French, and ended up lynching noblemen and sacking the empty royal palace. The city's Jacobins, emerging from 3 years of prudent obscurity since the breakup of their clubs in 1795, appealed to Championnet to intervene. He could not resist this opportunity to emulate Bonaparte, but 1,000 French men and 3 times the number of Lazzaroni lay dead or wounded before the blue, red, and yellow tricolor of the Parthenopean Republic flew over Naples. A provisional government of Jacobins now set about drafting a constitution, while a club dedicated to public instruction elaborated a whole range of utopian reform projects. Championnet, however, was recalled in disgrace after expelling a critical civil commissioner from Naples in true Bonapartist style. His dismissal was the last triumph under the directory of the civil arm over the military, and even that rebounded in June when a court-martial failed to convict him, and by then The republic he had created in southern Italy had disappeared. The Russians had arrived in Lombardy, and in order to avoid being cut off, the new French commander in Naples, MacDonald, abandoned the city in a desperate march northwards. His collaborators were left with no force to rely on but a few hundred French troops garrisoning at strong points. This might be enough to contain the Lazzaroni, but it was certainly no match for the royalist forces now making for Naples from the south. The Christian army of the Holy Faith, led by a fighting prince of the church, Cardinal Ruffo. Ruffo was a Calabrian who had served in the papal curia, but had found more favor at the Neapolitan court. Sailing with the royal family to Sicily, he offered to raise his native province for the king before the French got there. Feeling he had nothing to lose, Ferdinand IV accepted the offer, and Ruffo landed in Calabria with a handful of companions and a banner bearing the cross and the royal arms on 7th February. Within weeks, his followers had swelled to an army of 17,000 and were in control of the whole toe of Italy. Soon, the neighboring provinces of Apulia and Basilicata had fallen to them as well. Ruffo's technique was to appeal pointedly to social antagonisms in an area recently ravaged by natural disasters, overpopulated, deeply impoverished, and groaning under heavy indirect taxes and feudal burdens. He proclaimed the latter abolished while the Jacobins in Naples were merely toying with the idea, thus inferring that the French and their friends represented the rich and powerful. He also whipped up the deep-rooted antagonism of peasants for the towns, knowing that if all townsmen were not Jacobins, all Jacobins were certainly townsmen. As everywhere, political labels were stuck on innumerable long-standing local antagonisms and vendettas, and provided new justifications for pursuing them. The march of the Sanfedist army was a peasants' revolt, which in other circumstances might just as easily have been against the Bourbon government. Like other such revolts, it was chaotic, undisciplined, and largely local in its impetus and effects. Law and order in Calabria did not recover from its for decades. Even so, enough of those involved were prepared to march with Ruffo up to defenseless Naples, where they arrived on June 13 as British ships threatened the city from the bay. A week of confused siege and renewed anarchy followed. The populace, reported Ruffo, appalled at the savagery now unleashed, and many outlaws who have come to fight for the king are robbing and plundering without let or hindrance. All respectable folk are fleeing to the country. Our better soldiers are guarding the houses against pillage, but to little purpose. Often the pretext is Jacobinism. That is what they call it. But in fact, it is plunder that often produces Jacobin proprietors. I find the same in small places. to the cry of "Long live the King," they dare anything with impunity.